The Figure in the Shadows by John Bellairs, Chapter 3. The next morning, as soon as he got up, Louis went downstairs to look for the mysterious postcard. He looked under the hall rug and into the cracks between the floorboards. He looked into the blue willowware vase where Jonathan kept his canes. He looked everywhere. The card had vanished. None of the cracks in the floor was wide enough for it to have slipped through, and the card couldn't very well have floated back out through the covered mail slot. Where did it go? Louis didn't feel like talking to Uncle Jonathan about the card, but as he ate his Cheerios that morning, a comfortable explanation occurred to him. The card was probably just part of Uncle Jonathan's magic. Louis had lived in the house of a practicing wizard for over a year now, and during that time he had come to expect strange sights and sounds. A mirror on the coat rack showed you your face when you looked in it, sometimes. But more often than not, it would show you Roman ruins in the desert, or Mayan pyramids, or Melrose Abbey in Scotland. There was an organ in the front parlor that sang radio commercials, and the stained glass windows in the enormous old house changed their pictures from time to time, all by themselves. Maybe the ghostly card was one of Jonathan's little jokes. Louis could have found out his answer, if his answer was right, by asking Jonathan, since Jonathan controlled all the magic in the house, but he was afraid to ask. If his answer was wrong, he didn't want to know it. One afternoon in the middle of October, Louis decided to go back to school early. Most of the time, he waited out the noon hour at home because he was afraid of getting beat up, but today he was going back early because Rosarita had talked him into it. Louis and Rosarita had a long talk about his fears. She had tried to persuade him that the only way to conquer his fears was to meet them head-on. He had to force himself to go back to the playground right after lunch. After the first time, the second time would be easier, and so on. This was the way Rosarita argued. Louis had been stubborn at first, but he had finally agreed to try it her way. To make things easier for him, Rosarita had agreed to meet him in the alley next to the school. He wouldn't have to get into a football game or anything. The two of them would just stand around and talk. They could talk about the model Roman galley they were building out of balsa wood. It would be a lot of fun. When Louis got to the school, he peered down the long, narrow alley. No Rosarita. At the far end, he could hear kids shouting and playing. Cautiously, he began to edge his way down the alley toward the playground. He always expected to get jumped, and sometimes it really happened. Louis had gotten about halfway down the alley when he heard something off to his left. It sounded like grunting and scuffling. Louis turned and saw two kids fighting in the dark, shadowy space between the buttresses of the Episcopal Church. The kids were Rosarita and Woody Mingo. Louis stood watching, paralyzed with fear. Woody had one hand around Rosarita's waist, and with his other hand he was pulling her hair. Hard, so it must really have hurt, but Rosarita said nothing. Her eyes were closed and her teeth were set in a rigid grimace. "Come on," Woody snarled. "Take it back." "No. Take it back. I said no, and ow, I meant no." Woody grinned his nastiest grin. "Okay, then." He gave Rosarita's hair a short, vicious yank. Her grimace got tighter and her teeth ground together, but she still refused to scream. Louis didn't know what to do. Should he run and get the principal or go for the police? Or should he try to take on Woody all by himself? He thought about Woody's knife, and he was afraid. Now Woody saw Louis. He laughed just the way he did when he stole Louis's hat. "Hey, fat guts, ain't you going to rescue your girlfriend?" Woody gave Rosarita's hair another yank, and she winced. Rosarita opened her eyes and glanced at Louis. "Go away, Louis," she hissed. "Just go away." Louis stood there, clenching and unclenching his fists. He looked toward the street where cars were slowly rolling past. He looked toward the playground where he could hear kids laughing and shouting and playing. "Come on, lard ass. You want to try and take me? Let's see you try." Louis turned and ran. Down the alley, out onto the sidewalk, across the intersection, up Green Street toward home. His feet slapped the pavement under him, and he could hear himself crying as he ran. He stopped halfway down Green Street because he couldn't run anymore. His side hurt, and his head ached, and he wished he were dead. When he had finally gotten his breath back, he wiped his eyes, blew his nose, and trotted the rest of the way home. Uncle Jonathan was raking leaves in the front yard when Louis came stomping moodily up the sidewalk. "Hi, Louis," he called, waving cheerfully with his pipe. "Did they let school out early, or—" Clang went the front gate, slam with the front door. A few seconds after, Jonathan dropped his rake and went in to see what was wrong. He found Louis crying with his head on the dining room table. "God-damn dirty, rotten, no good, God-damn dirty," was all Louis would say over and over. Jonathan sat down in the chair next to him and put his arm around him. "Come on, Louis," he said gently. "It's okay. What's wrong? Do you want to tell me what's happened?" Louis wiped his eyes and blew his nose several times. Then slowly and brokenly he told his uncle the whole story. "And I ran away, and she'll never want to have anything to do with me ever again," he sobbed. "I wish I was dead." "Oh, I doubt if Rosarita is going to scratch you off her social list," said Jonathan, smiling and patting him on the shoulder. "She just wanted to take care of herself, that's all. She's a real tomboy. If she got into a fight with Woody, I guess she figured she could handle herself." Louis turned and looked at Jonathan through his tears. "You mean she won't hate me on account of I'm a coward and a weakling?" "You're not either one of those," said Jonathan. "And anyway, if Rosarita wanted a lug for a best friend, she'd have found a lug. She's a very stubborn girl, and she does what she wants to do, and I think she likes you a lot." "You do?" "Mm-hmm. Now I'm going to go finish raking the leaves, so we can have a bonfire in the driveway tonight. I'll write you a note Monday so you won't be in trouble with Miss Haggerty, and, well, why don't you go work on that ship model?" Louis smiled gratefully at his uncle. He hiccuped a few times, as he often did when he'd been crying. "Okay, Uncle Jonathan. Thanks a lot." Louis went up to his room, and for the rest of the afternoon he was all wrapped up in the world of Greek and Roman triremes and the great sea battles of Salamis and Actium. Just before dinner, the phone rang. Louis took the stairs 2 at a time and almost fell on his face. "Hi," he panted as he picked up the receiver. "Is that you, Rosarita?" He heard a giggle at the other end. "If it hadn't have been, what would you have done?" Louis felt relieved. "Are you mad at me?" he asked. I just called to find out what happened to you." Louis felt his face getting red. "I felt kind of sick, so I went home. Did Woody beat you up?" "Nope, a couple of teachers came by and made us stop fighting. I would have fixed him if it hadn't have been for my darned hair. I think I'll get a crew cut." "How come you were fighting?" "Oh, I told him he was a dirty little sneak thief for stealing your hat, and he wanted me to take it back, and I wouldn't." Louis was silent. He felt the way he had when Rosarita said that she wished she had been there to keep Woody from stealing the hat. It was a confusing feeling. He was grateful to her for sticking up for him, but it felt awful not to be able to fight and win your own battles. Boys were supposed to be able to do that. "Are you okay?" Rosarita asked. Louis had been silent for a whole minute. Yeah, sure, I was just thinking," Louis stammered. "Woody didn't hurt you, did he?" Rosarita snorted disdainfully. "Oh, he wouldn't do anything to me but pull my hair because I'm a girl." "Hey, Louis, yeah? Let's get to work on that ship again. You want to bring it over to my house tonight?" "Okay. See you after dinner. Bye." "Bye." Louis was relieved to know that Rosarita didn't hate him for running away, but he kept thinking about the fight between her and Woody, and that night he had a dream about it. In the dream, Woody had knocked Rosarita down, and her head was bleeding. Louis grabbed him, and he socked him. And then Woody pulled his knife and held it in front of Louis's nose. Then Woody said, "I'm going to cut your tongue out." And Louis awoke suddenly. He was sitting up in bed, and his pajamas were drenched with sweat. It was a long time before he could get back to sleep again. The next morning, when Louis got up, he decided that he was going to get thin and tough like Woody. He got down on the floor and tried to do 10 push-ups, but he could only do 3 before he collapsed. Then he tried sit-ups, but when he lay down flat on his back, he couldn't struggle up to a sitting position unless he thrashed around and used his elbows. He stood up and tried to touch his toes without bending his knees, but he couldn't do it. Trying made his head ache. Finally, he tried jumping jacks. They were fun because you could clap your hands over your head when you did them, but the flab on Louis's thighs clapped too when his legs came together, and the sound depressed him. Also, he was afraid of bringing down the plaster in the room below, so he gave up and went downstairs to have breakfast. It was Saturday morning, and Mrs. Zimmerman had come over to make breakfast. Although she lived next door, she usually cooked for the Barnevelts, and on Saturdays she always made something very special for breakfast. It might be donuts or pancakes or sausages or strawberry shortcake or French toast with comb honey and peach preserves. This morning Mrs. Zimmerman was making waffles. Louis watched her as she poured some of the rich yellow batter into the black iron grid. Then he remembered his resolution. Mrs. Zimmerman?" he said. "Yes, Louis." I don't think I'll have any waffles this morning. Could I just have a bowl of cornflakes? Mrs. Zimmerman turned and looked at him strangely. She was about to go over and feel his forehead when she remembered what Jonathan had told her about the fight between Woody and Rosrita. Mrs. Zimmerman was a very shrewd woman, and it didn't take her long to guess what Louis had up his sleeve. She shrugged her shoulders and said, "Okay, that'll just be a little bit more from me and your uncle." Louis managed to hold his resolve all the way through breakfast. It was pure torture to see those nice golden waffles and that thick maple syrup being flipped on the back. Whoops, skipped a page. Let's start that sentence again. Louis managed to hold his resolve all the way through breakfast. It was pure torture to see all those nice golden waffles and that thick maple syrup being passed back and forth in front of his nose, but he swallowed hard and ate his soggy, tasteless cornflakes. After breakfast, Louis went down to the junior high gym to work out. He punched the punching bag until his fists were sore, then he rolled up his sleeves and flexed the muscle in his right arm. He couldn't tell if anything was happening, so he walked across the basketball court to find Mr. Hartwig. Mr. Hartwig was the gym instructor. He was a big, cheerful man who was always throwing medicine balls at you and telling you to hit that line and suck in your gut and hop 2, 3, 4 and stuff like that. When Louis found him, Mr. Hartwig was organizing some informal boxing matches among boys who just seemed to be standing around doing nothing. "Hi, Mr. Hartwig," Louis yelled. "Hey, can I see you for a minute?" Mr. Hartwig smiled. "Sure thing, Louis. What can I do for you?" Louis rolled up his sleeve again and held out his arm. He flexed the muscle, or what was supposed to be the muscle. "Do you see anything, Mr. Hartwig?" asked Louis hopefully. Mr. Hartwig tried hard to keep from smiling. He knew Louis, and he knew something about his problems. "Well, I see you're on," he said slowly. "Have you been working out today?" "Yeah, kinda. Doesn't it show?" Louis flexed his arm again. He was getting embarrassed with all these kids standing around watching. Normally he wouldn't have done anything like this in front of them, but he really had to know. Mr. Hartwig was an expert. He could tell if Louis's muscles were getting bigger. Mr. Hartwig put his arm around Louis and took him aside. "Listen, Louis," he said quietly, "it takes more than 5 minutes with a punching bag to build up your muscles. You have to work at it for weeks and months and even years. So don't be discouraged if nothing happens right away, okay? Now go back and hit that bag." Mr. Hartwig smiled kindly and gave Louis a light, playful jab in the stomach, the way he did when he liked you. Louis winced. He thanked Mr. Hartwig and went back to the punching bag. But his heart really wasn't in it now. If it was going to take years for him to build up a manly physique, he might as well knock it off and have lunch. It was almost 1 o'clock and he was getting hungry. Later, Louis was sitting at the counter at Heathmoth's drugstore. He had just had 2 hot dogs and a large cherry Coke for lunch. He had just had 2 hot dogs and 2 large cherry Cokes for lunch. Now he was leafing through a Captain Marvel comic book. Captain Marvel was slugging it out with the usual collection of crooks and villains. His uppercuts landed with sounds like zock and pow. Louis had tried a few uppercuts, but they had never landed on anybody's chin. The kids he had tried to use them on had just stepped away and laughed. Louis read all the stories in the comic books, and then flipped to the back. There were ads for things like a Vacatex, an evil-looking gadget that resembled a hypodermic. It was supposed to suck out unsightly blackheads. That was more of a teenager's problem. Louis had other things to worry about. He turned to the last page, and there was the Charles Atlas ad. It was always there, and it was always the same. There was a little cartoon story about a 97-pound weakling who got so strong he could get even with the guy who kicked sand in his face at the beach. And there at the bottom of the ad was Charles Atlas himself in a white bathing suit that always made Louis think of a baby's diaper. Mr. Atlas looked as if he were covered with grease, and he was bulging and rippling all over with muscles. He was shaking his fist at Louis and daring him to try his dynamic tension exercises. Under the picture of Mr. Atlas was the little coupon that you were supposed to cut out. Louis had been on the point of cutting it out many times, but he had always stopped for some reason or other. Now he ripped out the page, folded it neatly, and slipped it into his pocket. That afternoon when he got home, he put the coupon in an envelope with a quarter and mailed it off to Charles Atlas. And we'll pause there.